Representation matters. But as indigenous Chicano people, we can't just sit back and wait for mainstream media outlets to make it happen for us. And nor should we. We started the Tales from Atlantis podcast because we believe that it is imperative for Chicanos, Chicanas, and Chicanx people to produce our own media and tell our own stories. And the way we choose to do this is by using Buzzsprout to host the podcast. Buzzsprout is by far the easiest and best way to launch a professional podcast. You'll get a podcast website, audio players that you can drop into other websites, detailed analytics to see how people are listening, tools to promote your episodes, and much more. To start your own podcast and get a $20 Amazon gift card, follow the link in the show notes. This lets Buzzsprout know that we sent you and helps support the show. Buzzsprout, the easiest way to start a podcast. Now, on with the show.
You must excuse me. I've grown quite weary.
This hasn't been easy, I know. But you've learned a lesson. A lesson in honesty. Honesty to yourself and honesty to others. That lesson will stand you in good stead all your life.
I think we've all learned a good lesson. I've always heard that honesty is the best policy. Now I'm catching on to why that's so, and 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 why that's so.
Yali no Chime, and welcome to Tales from Atlantis, the show where we explore Mesoamerican pseudo-history, New Age nonsense, and other stories of adventure. We are your hosts, Curly Tlapoyawa
and Ruben Arellano, also known as Tlacatecat.
When one thinks of hotbeds of right-wing extremism and fascist movements, Mexico is probably the last place that comes to mind. Yet, Mexico has long been home to many far-right movements, often characterized by an affinity for Nazi symbolism and Catholic dogma, and sometimes even blended in with Mesoamerican identity. But where do these movements come from? What are their goals? And how have these movements influenced Mexican society today? Well, today we are joined by Dr. Luis Herrán Ávila. Luis is a historian of the Cold War in Latin America with an emphasis on conservative, anti-communist, and extreme right movements. After researching the comparative history of anti-communism in Mexico, Argentina, and Colombia, his current book project seeks to unveil the national and Latin American dimensions of right-wing activism in Cold War Mexico. The book project examines the history and Cold War transformations of right-wing dissidents to the Mexican post-revolutionary state and situates Mexico as a crucial hub for transnational anti-communist activism, shedding light on the various ways in which Mexican anti-communists forged links with Latin America, European, and East Asian fellow travelers. Dr. Herrán Ávila's publications in both English and Spanish reflect a range of related research interests such as right-wing youth, neofascism in Latin America, the history of political crime in the Americas, and the intersections between banditry and insurgency. I like that. Banditry and insurgency. So, please join us in welcoming our guest today, Dr. Luis Herrán Ávila.
Welcome, Luis.
How you doing, man?
Hey, thank you for the invitation, guys. I really appreciate having a chance to talk about my research here.
Yeah, well, thank you for coming. So you're a professor at the University of New Mexico, my alma mater, and you've been teaching there for how long now?
It's been 3 years.
3 years. And what classes are you currently teaching?
So I teach a range of things, mostly 20th century Mexico. I also teach a course that it's basically an introduction to Latin American culture and society, and also a few graduate courses on Latin America and the global Cold War, also on violence in Latin American history, And what is the other thing? Oh, and inter-American relations, which sounds very boring, right? But I tend to teach it. Kind of try to deviate from the standard kind of diplomatic history and try to go more into things like gender and race and cultural relations between the two Americas, as we say.
You spice it up a little bit.
Exactly.
So I was telling Ruben earlier that, because I don't get to go as often as I would like, but whenever I'm in Mexico City, I always go down to the Zócalo and I look for books. And every single time, every single time I go down there, I see copies of the Protocols of the Elders of Zion and copies of Mein Kampf being sold on the street. And that always blew my mind. And what it did was it sparked me to start doing research on why are these books even here? What does Mexico have to do with these far right ideologies, with this anti-Jewish worldview? And just in my research and talking to people there, it really came out that there is a history of anti-Jewish, anti-Chinese, just basically anti-foreigner in general movements in Mexico, and they're often wrapped up in these right-wing worldviews, usually but not always couched in Catholicism, right? Because there are the non-religious right-wingers, but they generally tend to be couched in Catholicism. And then the more research I did, I started seeing these right-wing groups that they had incorporated even Mesoamerican symbology into their movement, which I thought was super interesting and bizarre. So I am by no means an expert in right-wing Mexico, which is why we brought you on. So if you could elucidate for us, what the hell's going on in Mexico, man?
Right. Well, that's it's a complicated question, but I'll try to make it as legible or as intelligible as possible. Mexico has a long history of, let's say, relations with right-wing ideologies, particularly with, with fascism, right? So, for instance, in the 1920s, relatively early in the 20s, as Mussolini was rising in Italy, there is a small and short-lived Mexican fascist party, right? Very urban, again, very small. It wasn't really, a major political actor, but it left an imprint, of this sort of, as part of a sort of reaction to what was happening with the Mexican Revolution, right? The end of the Civil War phase of the Mexican Revolution, and then the beginning of sort of the state building, right, era of the revolution. You have these reactionary ideologies, if you want to call them that, right, that were calling attention against the danger that Mexico was going to become something like a Bolshevik Russia, right? That fascist party didn't take off. Later, there was another organization called the Confederation of the Middle Class, which sounds pretty harmless, right? Right, and I froze for a second. Yeah, this might happen a few times. So this Confederation of the Middle Class was, again, a small urban organization, but what they did was they did a propaganda campaign against communism, right? And for the defense of religion, the defense of family, traditional values, etc. And interestingly enough, just recently, President Andrés Manuel López Obrador, in one of his morning conferences, he showed, right, a flyer from that Confederation of the Middle Class as an example of the long history of right-wing activism and right-wing propaganda in Mexico. Right? It was kind of one of those moments in which a historian like me was like, "Oh, this is so great that even the president is talking about this." For his own purposes, of course, not necessarily a scholarly interest. But it goes to show again how, from the 1920s, even before Nazism and Hitler, right, into the 1930s, what we see is a sort of what I would call a sort of contest, right? Or a conflict over the meanings of nationalism, right? And of revolutionary nationalism. So there are those that that embrace the revolution in some way, in that find that ideologies like Italian fascism or German Nazism are sort of also revolutionary ideologies that can help Mexico combat the danger of communism, atheism, anti-clericalism, etc. This, of course, happens more prominently during the presidency of Lázaro Cárdenas, right? Who is the one that, he's kind of an icon of what we could call Mexican social democracy, Mexican socialism even, right? So there was this very strong reaction to Lázaro Cárdenas's policies in education, right? The fact that he basically implemented a socialist model of education, which, of course, it gets complicated. It wasn't directly socialist, but socialist values and socialist outlook into education. So while that is happening, there is it's still a small sector of Mexicans that see Nazi Germany, but also Franco's Spain, right? Portugal, right, with Salazar, the Salazar dictatorship, and of course, still the example of Mussolini's Italy as sort of an alternative path, right, for Mexico, right, against the United States. And this is very important. This particular strain of the right that kind of explodes in the 1930s is to some extent anti-imperialist, right? They are anti-Yankee, right? So they see the fascist experiences as a way for Mexico to fight off this harmful influence of the United States, to find or rediscover its own roots, right? And then launch a sort of project of national greatness that could be kind of similar to those that were happening again in Europe. And inevitably, anti-Semitism becomes a very important part of this alternative national revolutionary ideology, right? And this is why the Protocols of the Elders of Zion or Nazi literature it has a place in Mexican history, and it's a long history, right? Because people were reading those texts, translating, and then reading those texts very early on.
So,
and one of the
go ahead,
go for it.
Well, I just want to understand. You're saying that the reason why fascism took root in Mexico was due to the anti-imperialist sentiment among Mexicans after the Mexican Revolution. And because of that streak of fascism that was supposed to combat United States imperialism, therefore, if you're going to adopt fascism that is coming from Europe through Italy and by extension from Germany, that you're also going to adopt anti-Semite views? Is that correct?
Yes, I mean, to some extent, yes. There is a historian and anthropologist, Claudio Lomnitz.
Mm-hmm.
Maybe you guys know his work. He has this little book. I can't remember the exact title, but it's a book that talks about sort of the nationalism that is kind of forms around the early years of the Mexican Revolution. What he argues is that early nationalism was deeply anti-Semitic,
mm-hmm.
right? I've read the book, and to my sense is that he overstates the case a little bit, because not all nationalism in the 1910s and 1920s was anti-Semitic, but there is a strong element of anti-foreign sentiment
mm-hmm.
in the Mexican Revolution, right? With we know the history of the Porfirio Diaz dictatorship, right, favoring foreign interests, right? There was violence against foreigners during the Mexican Revolution, right? And there is indeed a sort of the combination of this xenophobia, right, that comes from the Mexican Revolution, with some of that very old strain of Catholic anti-Semitism, right? So these different ideas, I mean, they sort of converge, and they result in different combinations. No? So we can say, well, they're anti-imperialist because they are for instance, against the United States. Also because the United States represents not just, let's say, materialist capitalism, but also represents Protestantism, right, which is a threat to Mexican Catholicism. So there's that nationalist sort of Catholic element. The U.S. also represents liberalism, right?
Right.
And liberalism is an old enemy of the church as well, right?
And by liberalism, you mean more like cultural libertarianism, not political liberalism.
Well, partly political liberalism, because both the church and also sort of conservatives in general despise the idea of popular sovereignty.
Okay, right. Yeah,
right.
Yeah.
And in Mexico, liberalism was born at a time where it was about, let's say, individual liberties and, let's say, free trade, but also about popular sovereignty, right? So with Juarez and all of these very strong liberal movements of the 19th century. So there's this idea, right, that the U.S. represents liberalism, Protestantism, materialism, right? So the anti-imperialism of these right-wingers is actually of a very, again, reactionary and conservative strain, right? And we usually don't think about anti-imperialism in that register, right? And then, so the way in which this comes with fascism, which is weird, right? Because fascism is actually an imperialist ideology.
Right.
It's militaristic. It's about conquest, right?
Authoritarian.
It's about expanding authoritarian dictatorship and all of these things, right?
That seems to fall in line with Catholicism, though.
Yes, and I will touch on that also. I also want to touch on that because we tend to think also of, just as we think that anti-imperialism is only on the left, we tend to think, or at least scholars of, let's say, the Mexican right, say, well, the Mexican right, of course there were some fascists, but it's not fascist because it's very Catholic, right? So there's this idea that for some reason...
like religion's going to save them from being fascist? I mean, weren't the Italian fascist Catholic? And
wasn't Mussolini a Catholic, and Franco was a Catholic?
And the Nazis were a state religion, so it's really religiosity that drives it, whether it's Catholicism or something else. It's this idea of supreme authority.
Right. I mean, what some historians, I mean, again, those that want to be moderate about the argument, what they say is, well, the Nazi regime, for instance, had a very strained relationship with the Vatican, right? Which is partly true. But also, there was a lot of collaboration, right, between the Nazi regime and the Vatican. What we know also is that the rest of Europe, for instance, Hungary, Romania, right, the Balkans, we have dozens of experiences with fascist dictatorship that was also underpinned or supported by a Catholic ideology. Right? So this supposed incompatibility between Catholicism and fascism, in my opinion, is just nonsense, right? And it actually helps us understand how Mexico, right? It helps us understand the Mexican right-wing movements that emerged after the 1930s and the relative, although they were never, mass movements, they are very much present in the public sphere. They publish, they mobilize, they have rallies, right? As Curly was saying, right? The circulation of this literature fascist literature, Nazi literature, anti-Semitic literature is due to a great extent to the presence that these groups have in Mexican society, right? So it's kind of one of those things that it surprises a lot of people, but because it breaks with the usual narrative about what Mexico is as a country.
I think it has it kind of reeks of the special pleading fallacy, almost like, yes, there are fascists that were Catholic, but we're different over here in Mexico. We're not really fascist. We're kind of just conservative, ultra-conservative, but not necessarily fascist. So it's kind of like a special pleading, make an exception for us because this is our pet ideology over here, and we don't want to be associated.
Fascists.
Exactly. We're lowercase fascists.
Lowercase f.
Right.
Well, one of the organizations that sticks out to me is the gold shirts. Right. And the Dorados, I think they were called. And what's interesting is they're still around. I actually, they changed their name to Acción Revolucionaria Mexicanista, or maybe they carried both names at the same time. I'm not sure. But if you get on Facebook or Twitter or social media, you still find Acción Revolucionaria Mexicanista groups. They're all closed. They're all private. I tried to join them, and they wouldn't accept my request because I was trying to get research done for this episode. But what I did
Your reputation precedes you, Curly.
Yeah, right. And I wish I knew which newspaper this comes from, but this is from an American newspaper about the formation of the gold shirts. And the headline is Mexican Gold Shirts to Drive Out Foreigners. And it says, Mexico, Monday, a semi-military gold shirt organization whose immediate aim is to drive out of Mexico all Jews, Chinese, Arabs, Turks, Armenians, and other undesirable foreigners is being developed by former army officers as the ARM. So I guess they had the same name, like at the same time. They were called the ARM and the gold shirts.
But how effective can they be if they're wearing gold shirts? I mean, you can see them a mile away.
Right? It's not very stealthy. It says, beyond this first objective, leaders of the movement say the purpose is to organize the people of Mexico so that they may achieve their social and economic independence by directing forces of public opinion. And then it goes on to say that the idea of the gold shirts, which are really blouses, it puts in parentheses, which is funny, was taken from Pancho Villa's favorite corps, the camisas doradas. The hat is a huichol straw, which looks something like a Texas sombrero. This is interesting. The coat of arms is an Aztec shield and a macuahuitl. And it says here they throw up a salute, which is their right arm upraised with a clenched fist, which they claim here's the old Aztec victory salute, which is nonsense. But it's interesting that this right-wing organization picked a shield, and they still use this as their.
When was it formed?
Nuestro escudo. It's the chimali, and it has a macuahuitl across it, and in the center it says ARM.
When was it? When was it formed? Was it the 1920s?
1933.
33. So the raised fist predates the Black Power movement.
And the Chicano movement.
Well, yeah, of course. But, I mean, it's usually attributed to, with its origins to the Black Power movement. Interesting.
Well, these guys are claiming it's the ancient Aztec victory salute. And then I also found an old newspaper put out by the Acción Revolucionaria Mexicanista. And the headline here is El Judío, El Chino y demás extranjeros indeseables. He ahí el peligro. So if that gives you any clues to where these guys were coming from.
What say you, Luis?
Well, they are definitely, a fascinating organization. 1933, it's a key year also. That's the rise of Adolf Hitler in Germany. And it's not a coincidence, I think, that they founded their movement at that time. What Curly just mentioned, for instance, of their background, of some of the leadership, right, as former Villistas, is very interesting as well, no? Because we're talking about sort of the popular. Did I freeze?
You did.
Yes,
Can you say that again? Just
so as I was saying, yes. That it's very striking that they are, former villistas, right? Because the villismo is the popular element of the Mexican Revolution, right? So these are not necessarily elite, right? A wealthy elite.
Well, hold on. I may have a difference of opinion there. While maybe the people who were fighting with Villa were common folk, but Villa represented the established elite of the North, as opposed to Zapata, who really led a popular front of campesinos and indigenous people who were unhappy with the way that the government was mistreating them in the South. So there is a difference. Mm-hmm. So it kind of makes sense that the Villa's followers would be more fascistic or inclined to be more fascistic than, say, Zapatistas.
Yes. I mean, here's the thing. I guess what I meant was that villismo, let's say as a program, if there was such a program, right? There's a lot of discussion about whether Villa actually had a platform of revolutionary transformation. Right. But the basis, let's say the most of Villa's fighters, for instance, were very much poor rural workers, miners, and people like that. No? What happens is that, of course, when the new revolutionary elite is formed, right? All of these former fighters become generals and things like that. There is a struggle for power, no? And there are these factions, such as the one led by Nicolás Rodriguez. That's the name of the leader of the Golden Shirts. They actually espouse an ideology that is very much popular, or, I don't want to use the word populist, but it's something like that, right? They appeal to, the Mexican people, right? And these deep historical roots, right, such as the Aztecs and things like religion, right? Because they don't only combine, they do combine Aztec symbology with things like the importance of Catholic religion as part of national identity and the Hispanic legacy in Mexican culture, no? So it's you can say, well, that's an elite or ideology or an ideology of the wealthy Mexicans, but it has this popular component, which is very interesting, the ideology of the movement itself, no? And another thing that's important here is that their beginnings are mostly about xenophobia, right? It's about the Chinese, about the Jews, and any other foreigners, particularly Middle Easterners, that were established in Mexico. No? And this is, again, similar to fascist experiments in Europe. It's very similar to right-wing and fascist ideologies that are also developing in the United States at the same time.
Well, talk about what's happening now. If you were to just transpose some words, we could just say that this is Trumpism, essentially, in the United States.
Yeah. Well, the basis of their ideologies, we can actually sum it up in saying Mexico first.
Mm-hmm. It's very nationalistic.
Yeah, well, in fact, their slogan of the ARM was Mexico para los Mexicanos, right?
Exactly.
So it was like right there in black and white. We knew exactly where these guys were coming from.
Exactly. And very interesting also that they do have, because of their connection to Villismo, they claim to have this legitimacy as a revolutionary group, right? They're not saying we're against the Mexican Revolution, but they're saying we are kind of carriers of the real, authentic, popular spirit.
Yeah, we're like the next logical evolution of the revolution is what we're bringing to the people.
What was Villa's? Do we know what he thought about this emergent fascistic populist party?
Oh no, he was dead. He was dead. He was killed. Villa was killed in 1923.
Oh, okay.
He didn't get to see the.
I guess what I was trying to ask. So during his time, when he was still alive, this wasn't occurring at all. This happens years after the fact. Okay.
Yes. And another thing, for instance, for instance, in my research at least, a very important component of what the golden shirts are saying is, watch out for communism, right? It's the foreigners, but it's foreigners that bring communism also. Those are a problem. So there is a strain very early on, even within the official party, right? In the 1920s, before the PNR is formed, but then after 1929, when it is formed, that is very anti-communist, right? That is revolutionary, that is nationalistic and anti-communist. So while the gold shirts might seem extreme, they actually worked together with the Plutarco Elias Calles presidency to crack down on radical left-wing union movements, labor movements, right? They were used as basically as shock troops, right? And you might wonder, well, why was Calles, right, a revolutionary president, sort of using far-right thugs, basically to beat up the communists or the leftists? Well, it's a political expediency, right? So there's this very interesting relationship between the golden shirts and the Mexican state that basically used this far-right movement in particular to crack down on radicals, particularly in the north. In Monterrey, for instance, there are stories about these epic battles in the streets, right, between left-wing union organizers and the golden shirts.
So I noticed that most of the conversation has centered around the time of the revolution or after that, and it might be anachronistic to refer to previous conservative movements, especially in the 19th century, as being fascistic or being fascist. But is there some precedents that you can sort of point to with what's happening in the post-revolutionary period to what was going on before that?
Mm-hmm. That's a really good question, because the umbrella term would be conservative.
Just conservative, right? Yeah, but something more fascistic in nature.
Right. Yes, it would be anachronistic to say, I don't know, that Iturbide was a kind of proto-fascist or something like that. Yeah. But we do see that folks that embraced fascistic ideas in the 20th century, they do have this obsession with, for instance, the Mexican Empire, right? Or with conservative political figures, such as, for instance, Lucas Alamán, who was, I will give Lucas Alamán credit for being kind of an interesting political thinker, but he's a figure of Mexican conservatism, right? So there is a kind of use of that 19th century history, right, to talk about a kind of a long-standing Mexican conservative tradition, right? That then folks in, let's say, the 1940s, 1950s, and later on will continue to vindicate and say, this is what it means to be conservative, right? The defense of the nation, the defense of Catholicism, the defense of tradition, and on all of these, even things like family values can go in there, right? Against the forces of anti-clericalism, liberalism, Judaism, communism.
Well, it's funny that you guys were like, it's anachronistic to call them fascists. What's a better word? And I'm like, Catholics.
Yeah.
Well, speaking of like the modern day or the more recent formulations of these worldviews, Netflix has that new documentary out called Who Killed Manuel Buendia? I believe that's what the documentary is called. And in it, they talk about an organization at the university in Guadalajara, I believe.
That is correct.
And they were called the Tecolotes, right? Or Los Tecos. Can you fill us in on these guys? Because it sounds like they had a really interesting history.
Yeah, they emerged, again, not coincidentally, also in the early 1930s, actually in 1934, They basically, it's a secret society, right? So a lot of what we know about them is by hearsay, or it's sometimes by testimonies from people that were members of this secret society.
So are these like the Illuminati? They exist, but they don't exist?
Sort of like that. Yes, there's a lot of urban legend about them, but also a lot of truth about what they think and what they do. No? So they appear in 1934. They are there is a battle in many parts of Mexico against socialist education, right? So it emerges from a student organization, the Federation of Students of Jalisco, right? That was led by Carlos Cuesta Gallardo, who was an engineering student, very young at the time, also a very mysterious figure, because there's no pictures of him. He was very public, right? Was this kind of very shadowy figure, right? So this organization appears as a kind of, again, secret society, fraternal society, ultra-Catholic, fighting against socialism. And they eventually get the support of businessmen and of Catholic organizations, the church, of course, to found the Autonomous University of Guadalajara. Right? It was called the University of the West back then, meaning of Western Mexico, right, in Guadalajara. Later on, they changed the name to Autonomous University of Guadalajara, and the idea was to have a kind of center of anti-socialist, pro-Catholic education and activism, right, in this very important city in Western Mexico. Right? So these tecos evolve again as a kind of secret society that has connections to business organizations. It ends up having very strong connections to the Mexican state, particularly in the 1960s. They have, of course, connection to the church and to a series of other, let's say, sectors of Mexican civil society. No? And today, they don't really, today they're a lot more careful, right, with their, let's say, their public image. You don't hear really about the tecos today, but they still own the Autonomous University of Guadalajara. They still run it. It's a very conservative institution. No? The interesting part here, again, to connect it back to the gold shirts, is that Carlos Cuesta Gallardo, the leader of Los Tecos, is said, we don't really know, there's no actual proof of this, is said to have spent some time in Nazi Germany in the mid-1930s. Right? That he actually met with high-ranking officers of the Nazi Party. We are not sure if this is true. What is true is that he did espouse strongly anti-Semitic ideas, that he never, let's say, a full-blown Nazi, but certainly a Catholic fascist. Right?
Well, in preparing for this talk with you, I think both of us, me and Curly, found the very same article independently, and it's called Mexico, a fascist group called Tecos, and it's got a really long title, and it was published in 1999 by outfit out in Canada that's associated with the United Nations. It's called something Immigration and Refugee Board of Canada. And in it, they talk about Carlos Cuesta Gallardo, the Tecos, but they also go on to say that there's another guy by the name of Raimundo Guerrero,
yes,
who was recruited into the organization by Gallardo. According to Anderson and Anderson, the Tecos have close links with the remnants of the Romanian Iron Guard fascist of Oria Sima in Spain. And the group publishes the anti-Semitic magazine Replica, serving as a liaison among right-wing death squads throughout Latin America. The Tecos joined an organization whose acronym is the WACL. I forget what that stands for, in 1972. And then they are more than just a collection of aging Nazis. Apparently, Manuel Buendia is the one that exposed their connection to Nazism before he was assassinated. So, so what can you tell us about those more sort of intimate connections that they have beyond just like your typical Nazi? Like, what about these other groups in Spain and elsewhere that they're connected to?
Right. So, I mean, that international, let's say, projection of this sector of the Mexican right is very interesting. It's actually a very important part of my research. Raimundo Guerrero, the guy that you mentioned, he's a sort of a pupil of Carlos Cuesta Gallardo. He is, I believe, a law professor at the Autonomous University of Guadalajara. And he becomes sort of the public and international face of the this wing of the Mexican anti-communist sort of universe, if you want to call it. You know? He indeed becomes a sort of Mexico's representative to the WACL, which is the World Anti-Communist.
Oh, that's right. That's
right. And this is also a very interesting organization. It's basically this conglomerate of government and non-governmental organizations from all around the world, which sole purpose is to fight communism in any way they can, right? Including, of course, violence. You know? So in that organization, you have people that are kind of, more on the liberal side of anti-communism, if you want, kind of more business-oriented folks. But you also have former Nazi collaborators, Eastern European fascists that fled Europe, of course, and that found refuge in places like the United States, right, in South America, etc. So Mexico has a presence in this organization, and through Los Tecos, right, they represent Mexico by saying they have this narrative about themselves, no? By saying, well, we have been fighting communism since the late 1920s, right, with the Cristero War, right? We are the inheritors of the Cristeros. That is the narrative that these Mexican anti-communists are using. Right? We were fighting socialism, right? Even before Spain was fighting, right, anarchism and communism during the Spanish Civil War, right? So they create this narrative about Mexico being at the forefront of this anti-communist struggle, and they come together, in a very smooth way, with folks like former Iron Guard officers from Romania. They come together also with some Croatian fascists, right? The infamous Ustasha, that was kind of that fascist movement in Croatia. They come together with Ukrainian fascists as well, German neo-fascists, South American, everyone's there, right? They're part of this kind of what some people have called the Black International, right? As opposed to the Red International. You have a neo-fascist international that is sort of flourishing, particularly in the 1970s, right? And again, the Mexicans are there, and they are a very important part of that ecosystem.
So the and correct me if I'm wrong, but I think I read that the Autonomous University of Guadalajara and the Tecos were super supportive of Vicente Fox and PAN, and that some of them even served on his cabinet, like that he had appointed members of the Tecos to his cabinet. I don't know if I misread that or because I was going through stuff really quick, but regardless, can you touch on their relationships with the, Fox and the presidency and the PAN?
Kind of the later development of that strain, no? I mean, yes, the Tecos certainly. I don't know for sure, but I'm sure they were pleased by the fact that the PAN was in power for two terms, right, for 12 years. The relationship between the Fox administration and the right in general was very close. And indeed, there were far-right groups or ultra-conservative organizations in Fox's cabinet, right? And the most prominent figure was Carlos Abascal, who was a minister, minister of Interior under Fox. And Carlos Abascal, his father, Salvador Abascal, was one of the founders of the Sinarquista movement. Right? This movement that stemmed from the Cristeros, right, and that was formed in 1937, and that also espoused a lot of ideas and even rituals that resembled fascism, and I would even say they were fascist to a great extent, right? So that's a direct family connection with this kind of fascist legacy in Mexico, right? As far, let's say, insofar as to the Tecos' influence in the Fox sort of presidency, they didn't have, let's say, a person directly in the cabinet or in high-ranking posts. The group that had a few people is this other group called El Yunque. El Yunque is a sort of a...
Yes,
El
that's
Yunque.
who I got these guys mixed up with. It was El Yunque.
El Yunque, the anvil, right? So this group is very interesting because a lot of people tend to conflate them with Los Tecos. And what happens is that in the 1950s and early 60s, there's a split within the ultra-conservative movements in Mexico, right? So you have one strain, which is Los Tecos, that they are traditionalist Catholics, right? But then by 1962, 65, right, with the Second Vatican Council, the embrace by the church of all of these ideas of modernizing Catholicism, these guys say, screw that. We are traditionalists and we're going to abide by the old church.
We only want our mass in Latin.
Exactly.
Is this a split between the Tecos and Muro? I forget what Muro stands for.
Yes, exactly. Muro is part of the bigger umbrella that we call Yunque, right? Which is this. Okay. It's a collection of Catholic traditionalist organizations. The difference is that they sort of rather than dismissing the authority of the Pope, which is what the Tecos do in the 60s, they say, we don't agree with modernism, with the modernization of the church, but we respect and abide by the authority of Pope Paul VI. What's that?
Fascist light is what we get with the Yunque.
Yes, sort of. Right? They're more. For them, it's more. We can say it's just a different strain of that Mexican fascist Catholic sort of tradition, right? So Yunque, Muro, and a bunch of other organizations are actually clashing with Los Tecos for decades. There's actually violence. People get killed over these confrontations between the two factions. So, and to go back to Curly's question about Fox, there were some ministers and sort of and other public officials during his administration that were members of Yunque, right? From Querétaro, from Guanajuato, from Jalisco. I mean, there were really, there were at least a dozen of them that were in prominent positions, including the presidency of the PAN itself, the leadership of the party. And a lot of them are still around. The PAN is no longer at least it doesn't have the presidency, but they have a lot of power. Instance, again, in these states that I just mentioned, in the kind of central western region of Mexico, it's a hotbed of Mexican conservatism.
But they still have Fox as a spokesperson. I mean, what do you make of his outspokenness during the Trump administration? How does that fit into all this?
It's right. Fox and kind of his incursions into Twitter and YouTube and making fun of Trump, which, it's probably the only good thing that Fox has done in his life. I mean, first get the PRI out of power, which I will give him credit for, but then, make fun of Trump, and be an outspoken anti-Trumpist. Yeah. But I mean, he's still, a prominent representative of this.
He's still a panista at heart.
He's still a panista at heart, right? Business, church, right? Traditional values, and anti-socialist, anti-left, anti-progressive, etc.
Well, Curly's not going to admit to this, but didn't you take a picture with him once in Dallas?
No, he wanted it. I was going to bring this up. I was going to say the other best thing he ever did is he wanted to take a photo with me. You weren't there, so we were doing Danza Azteca. I think it was like a Cinco de Mayo or 16 de septiembre. It was probably 16.
Yeah.
So it was this big event for the 16, and this was before he, was elected.
He was running for president at
the time. Just started.
Yeah,
he was running for president, and he saw all these danzantes. So he walked up to us, and he was like, "Oh, I want to take a picture with you." And so my wife and I bounced. We just boop, 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 just got out of the picture, and no, we're good, bro. I think everybody else took a picture just to be polite, like this guy's a presidential candidate, and he had a lot of supporters there. I remember at this. It was in Dallas.
Dallas. Wasn't it at the church though? At the Catedral de Santuario downtown? Isn't that where it was?
Man, I don't even remember. It was a parade.
It was okay.
So I don't remember the.
So it might have been on Jefferson actually.
The
Cinco de Mayo parade in down Jefferson.
But he showed up, and I just remember a lot of people cheering when he got out of the car. And he had a lot of bodyguards, and his bodyguards looked like straight up white dudes. Like they were tall, blonde hair, blue eyes,
Jason Bourne,
straight up European dudes, and just speaking to each other in Mexican Spanish. So I'm like, what the hell's going on here? And I didn't realize who it was until he had got closer, and I was like, get away.
Yeah, and he was a very popular, particularly as a candidate. No, as a president, the popularity, of course, declined, but that popularity sort of concealed the fact that the group that was behind his candidacy was a very, very, very conservative sector of the PAN. I mean, the PAN has different factions. It has had
but this was known decades. Even during the election. Like this was public that he had that very conservative backing. It wasn't a big secret, because I remember that. Right.
But sort of people kind of bracketed that because he had the potential, and he actually defeated the PRI. No, so that was kind of the excitement about his candidacy was mostly because of that. No, now in places like Jalisco, Querétaro, and Guanajuato, his home state of Guanajuato, people threw their support behind him because he represented these precisely a lot of these original sort of Catholic conservative undercurrents in Mexican society and Mexican politics, right? So it was kind of a double game that he was playing. I am going to be the one that's going to defeat the PRI and bring democracy, right? Finally, but I'm also going to advance agendas that have been suppressed for a long time, right? And which is what his government actually brought. No?
So then, within the PAN, maybe you could touch briefly on. What were they calling them? Los Morenazis. I believe that the National Front, the Frente Nacionalista de Mexico, there was strong suspicions that they were started by members of the PAN. And a lot of the members of this group, there were photos with them, with representatives of the PAN. I remember seeing them. But I haven't really heard much about them. They came out in 2006. And I just remember seeing all these guys dressed like Nazis, like dark as my dad, right? Like straight up indigenous looking guys dressed like Nazis, carrying this flag that they have like this weird. It's almost like the Nahui Olin symbol.
Oh,
but it's
right, I remember those guys now. Yeah, it's
distorted. Yes. And the rumor was at the time that the PAN was either behind their formation or one of their big supporters.
Yeah, and this is a long history. There's a long history of the youth sort of section of the PAN, right? The youth groups of the PAN being attracted to far-right ideologies. For instance, I found I mean, there's probably examples from before, but I found, for instance, a prominent member of Muro, right, of this far-right student organization from the 60s. He actually began his political career, as a member of the PAN. He was a panista, right, and he left the PAN, right, because he was disillusioned with the PAN being a sort of Christian democratic party. They thought they were too moderate, right? And this guy was from Guanajuato, right, from Celaya, I believe, which is a very conservative city. So he moves on, and he becomes not only a leader of Muro, but also a sort of link to other neo-fascist organizations in Latin America and also in Europe, right? He's actually known, his nickname was El Führer. So you can imagine, so you can imagine how you can just imagine the personality, like the type of panista and the type of right-winger that he was, right? Very much on the extreme, no? So these Morenazis that you mentioned, Curly, I mean, you can probably look all throughout the 70s, 80s, and up to today, and there's always been, let's say, a kind of attraction, right, in these young people that are part of the PAN, again, particularly in that region of Mexico, that find that Nazism, for some reason, makes sense. Right?
Well,
appeals
speaking of Nazis, I was wondering if perhaps, since we're on the subject now, I mean, not that we haven't been, but more so, what can you tell us about Salvador Borrego Escalante and his book, Derrota Mundial? What's going on there?
Well, so there's a lot going on there. And to use the Morenazis also as an entry point to that, I mean, Salvador Borrego died very recently, 2018, 17.
Yeah, he was like 104.
Get out of here!
It's crazy.
Yeah, he was. He was really. I mean, he was kind of immortal, right? Until, I mean, he was 99 or something like that. He was still giving lectures and conferences, right? A lot of them for PAN groups. Like local PAN organizations, right? Catholic organizations. And many of them happen to be youth organizations, very similar to those in which these Morenazis sort of emerged. No? So Salvador Borrego is sort of, I mean, he is the most important neo-Nazi / fascist writer and author, I will say, of Latin America.
Yeah, well, before we get too deep into it, we should mention that his book, Derrota Mundial, or The Worldwide Defeat, so this was published originally in the 50s, I think, like 1953, and it's been, I mean, they've released over 50 editions of it in multiple languages. I found a copy in English that was released this year, copyright 2021, and the thesis of his book, the Derrota Mundial, the worldwide defeat, is that when the Allied forces defeated Hitler, it was a loss for the entire world, because then the forces of the Jews and the communists were going to overtake the world, and that all humanity lost when Hitler lost. That's the argument that he's trying to make in this book. And this dude's a Mexicano, and it just blew my mind. You were the one who brought it up to me. You were the first to mention him to me. So I looked him up and I was like, what the hell? But the thing that really caught my eye is that the foreword to his book is written by Jose Vasconcelos.
Dun, dun, dun.
We've covered him on the show before, Nazi sympathizer, creator of the whole La Raza Cósmica nonsense. And he writes this glowing foreword to this book in praise of Hitler. And I just want to quote real briefly from Vasconcelos's foreword. He says, "The distribution of the book by Borrego is of the highest patriotic interest for all Spanish-speaking peoples. Us, heirs of the epic of the Reconquest that saved Christendom of the invasion of the Moors, and of the Counter-Reformation headed by Philip II that saved Catholicism of the perilous conspiracy of the Lutherans and Calvinists. No one is more obligated than us to unmask the hypocrites and to contain the advance of the perverse. I mean, this guy was swinging from Borrego's nuts, man. And it's so bizarre because Vasconcelos, if you don't know Mexican history, he really helped develop the whole national identity of the Mexicano as being the mestizo, quote unquote, and that being the national character of the country, of what made a Mexican. But his version of what a mestizo was, right? This mixed blood person was more like totally praising the European and then trying to drag the indigenous kicking and screaming into modernity, right? And so he had a very, very white supremacist. I mean, the guy was a Nazi sympathizer. So for him to write the foreword of this book by Salvador Borrego makes perfect sense. But anyway, that's my little intro for the listeners, if they don't know who he is or what the book is about.
No, I think you bring up a very important connection there with Vasconcelos. As you said, he's, credited for being kind of the most prominent figure of what we can call Mexican cultural nationalism, right? And of course, there's a kind of a weird thing about, let's say, Vasconcelos' relationship with Nazi ideology, which is that if you read The Cosmic Race, he argues that, he actually argues against racial supremacy, right? He says, the white race is not, the white race has done horrible things because of the white supremacy ideology. But then what he embraces is a sort of Hispanic supremacy, right? He makes a distinction between Anglo-Saxon whiteness and Hispanic civilization. No? If you read Borrego, not Worldwide Defeat, but other of his writings where he gets into all of these theories about Mexican national identity and all that stuff, you see that he's basically the continuator of this tradition that begins with Vasconcelos, right? He talks about Mexico as a sort of unfinished nation, right? Kind of a young nation whose identity is still being formed and that needs to be protected from the forces of Judaism and communism, right? There's all of this sort of a kind of metaphysical elaboration about Mexican national identity. So aside from being a neo-Nazi, right, this Salvador Borrego, he was also again a sort of a intellectual paragon of the Mexican far right. And again, not only of the Mexican far right, but of the far right in Central America, in South America, in Spain, right? There are Spanish editions of his works. And as you say, Curly, also in the United States, because in the end, there is an attraction and appeal for these revisionist takes on the history of World War II, that it's all about, essentially, glorifying, Hitler and deprecating, the Jews, right?
Yeah. Well, before he died, and I found a photo of this. Before Borrego died, David Duke visited him in Mexico. Like, David Duke traveled to Mexico and had a sit down with Salvador Borrego, and they took a photo of it, which is interesting because, when people think about white supremacy and, racism, people, Mexicans can't be racist. But as you've shown, there's a long history couched in these far right movements of just built on Catholicism, fascism, authoritarianism, that just kind of lends itself naturally to becoming, very racist. So not only fascist and far right, but just outright racist.
And it also sort of connects to the the lost cause ideology of people who still believe in like celebrating the Confederacy and waving the Confederate flag and, you know, protesting that the flag doesn't represent racism, that it represents culture. And, you know, you have to question, well, what culture is it representing really? And so if you do the comparison between those people who celebrate the lost cause of the Confederacy, and then you sort of compare those to the Nazis, and for example, with books like this one, The World Defeat, it's a very similar rhetoric that's being espoused here between both ideologies, because they both lost, right? And there's this sense that had these people won, the world would be a better place. And the reason why it's terrible now is because we had these losses that humanity didn't take advantage of because of the evil forces that are at play, that we must continue to fight, that we must continue to go against and continue to wreak violence among those people that are within our ranks and people who are coming and invading our so it's the same kind of rhetoric.
Forever war.
It's an eternal xenophobic, racist, fascistic ideology that seems to prop its head from time to time in different forms, but it's the same kind of at the very basic at its core. It's almost the very same elements that you can find when you do a side-by-side comparison with these movements.
Well, so the big question is just so how popular is this book in Mexico, or how popular has it been in the past?
I mean, it's hard to tell, let's say. I mean, depends how you measure popularity, no? I mean, as you said, it has over 50 editions, right? And if you kind of add up the numbers, it's, you know, hundreds of thousands of actual
copies,
you know, that have circulated in Mexico and beyond Mexico. No? And now, of course, with the internet, you know, things are, I mean, with electronic books, it's just so much easier. No?
Oh, yeah. Actually, I have a PDF copy that I downloaded on Academia. Anyone can just basically download this thing. So besides the physical copies, who knows how many people have downloaded this thing worldwide?
Right.
And this is
there's a bunch of
2013, the copy that I have.
Right. Very recent. No, I mean, and there's a bunch of editions which are really kind of more like pirate editions that are from just all over the world, right? I've seen like Bolivian editions, Argentine editions, Chilean editions of this book, no? Because it was so important when it came out, but it's become this part of a canon, right? In the Spanish-speaking world, particularly, that is, you know, for neo-Nazis, but also for many other, let's say, strains of right-wing politics. No, it's for neo-Nazis, let's say, those that, you know, wear the swastikas and the Nazi uniforms, but also for, you know, people that are, you know, far-right Catholics, right? That don't necessarily, you know, embrace the Nazi thing, but they will read Salvador Borrego because he's such an important figure for right-wing Catholic thought in the region. No? And also, I mean, going back to something you were saying, Ruben, which I think, I mean, connects sort of Salvador Borrego and this idea that you were saying of sort of the lost cause. No? It's, for instance, in his case, it's about, yes, Hitler and World War II, but for the Mexican right-wingers that read his work, the lost cause was the Cristero War.
Ah, good one.
Right?
Yeah.
And this is something that I try to sort of emphasize in my research, right? This idea of the post-Cristero right, sort of what happens to the Mexican right after the Cristero War, and this narrative, right, of an epic battle against the forces of anti-clericalism and communism, that, yes, we were defeated, right? And actually we were betrayed by the church. This is the narrative, right? Because the church signs the accords with the Mexican government. But then this is a battle that just extends all throughout the 20th century, right? So it's some survivors of the Cristero War, then the sons and daughters of the Cristeros, and then the grandsons and granddaughters of the Cristeros, and so on and so forth, that continue this battle, right? And it's there today in Mexican society, right? These references to the Cristero War as what inspires, for instance, people mobilizing against or protesting against López Obrador, right? They say, López Obrador represents socialism and communism, and this is what our forefathers fought for back in 1926, 1929.
Yeah, but what did you think of the movie?
I know, I was just going to ask the same thing. Didn't it come out like in 2012 for Greater Glory? And it was
For Greater Glory. And I remember
Andy
it
Garcia
being...
was he did the role of Calles, right?
No, he did the role of the Cristero commander, whose name slips my mind right now.
It wasn't Calles that he portrayed.
No, Calles. Actually, Calles. This is something I show my students all the time, with Andy Garcia, right, as the protagonist. But then Calles is played by Rubén Blades.
Oh, that's right. It's...
which is like the weirdest casting, right, ever.
Well, I remember the Catholic Church was like pushing it. I would see it advertised on Spanish language TV all the time, and there was all this saying like people thought Opus Dei had produced it or had a hand in producing it, and people were like, "Yeah, we really need to see this movie." And I'm like, "Do you know who these people were?" Like, this was like the Mexican Taliban, bro. Like, I don't know if we want to be supporting this movement.
And Andy Garcia promoted the movie a lot in the U.S. By saying, "Well, this is a movie about religious freedom."
Mm-hmm. Yeah,
right.
That's how it was painted.
So to appeal to an American audience, right, a conservative audience, of course, right, he framed it in that way. But then the role of the church and of the Opus Dei, I think it's been documented, and it's also very interesting because it's a kind of a transnational effort, right? It's a movie that has, for instance, one of the guys, if I remember correctly, that I think he's in the movie or that he endorsed the movie or produced or something like that, Eduardo Verástegui, who is a Mexican telenovela actor, right? Who is a major right-winger, like pro-life and all that. And he actually became a major spokesman for Trump in the United States. Right?
What?
So, yes, you can look him up, Eduardo Verástegui, and he's just a fascinating figure. And he had some participation in that with that movie. No? And again, this also goes to show that this, let's say, Mexican and Latin American right-wing movements also have this sort of cultural industry aspect to their work, particularly in more recent years, right? Where they are, making inroads into things like cinema.
Yeah, which he played Enrique Gorostieta.
Enrique Gorostieta, yeah.
The IMDb says. So one of the things that Ruben and I don't know if you've ever listened to this podcast before, but you should. It's one of the things that Ruben and I really invest a lot of our time investigating is like the origins of the Mexicayot movement, of La Mexicanidad, the Partido de la Mexicanidad, this nationalist movement that came out around like roughly the same time.
Yeah, it was,
all this other stuff
post-revolutionary.
All this stuff that was going on. And what we found, I don't remember if it was Rodolfo Nieva Lopez or if it was Juan Luna Cárdenas, but one of them, they say he did have like strong sympathies towards the Nazis. And that's it's always sat with me as like, oh shit, man. Like, what? This is terrible.
And I think it goes back to what you were saying, Luis, that with Buendia, for example, that yes, there's this sense of, or not Buendia, Vasconcelos, that there's this sense that there's a superiority complex that's being evoked, but it's on the Hispanic side, and I think with Lopez, the guy who's from the Movimiento Confederado Restaurador de la Cultura de Anáhuac, that guy, he at first he was a Hispanophile when he started out in the 20s as a young guy, and then later on he evolved into more of an indigenist and then adopted this Mexica identity. And so he still had that sort of nationalistic and supremacist view of himself, but now was being framed under the Mexica Azteca ideology and identity. And the same thing was going on with Luna Cárdenas. He's the first one that goes, he was studying in Germany around the time that Hitler and the Nazis were barely making a name for themselves. They were gaining power, and right before the Second World War hits, he's over there, he's studying, and he's picking up on some of these ideas about Aryanism, and so he's bringing that stuff back. But he's saying, and so he's not necessarily saying that the Aryans, that Mexicas were Aryans or that Aztecas were Aryans, but that Aztecas and that Anahuac, culture from Anahuac was just as great, or if not even greater than the Aryans themselves. So he was trying to place the indigenous Mesoamerican peoples on par in terms of supremacy along with the Aryans. And I think by extension, he was trying to insinuate that the Mexica Azteca were part of that same tradition of the Aryan race, which is, if you really do a deep dive, which we're not going to get into here, it sort of correlates back to this idea of the lost worlds and ancient civilizations and the primal civilization of Atlantis that spawned all these other civilizations, of which, the Mesoamerican peoples were. So it gets very convoluted quickly with, esoteric ideas and these weird occultist ideas as well, that were also part of the Nazi party and their ideology. So there's some correlation there. There's a lot of back and forth sharing of ideas going on with these groups.
Yeah, and I bring this up, Luis, because I want to have what I want to do is do some research and see if there was any direct connection between these right-wing movements that came out at that time and the Mexicayot organizations, and if there was any crossover between their membership or their leadership or their ideology. It feels to me like there had to have been, but I just haven't come across it yet. So
right.
That's
I
homework.
think there's at least just in terms of the ideological aspect. For instance, going back to the gold shirts, and the fact that they have Mexicanist in their name, this notion of Mexicanist or Mexicanism, right, is a kind of it's an idea that's, let's say, up for grabs, right? Particularly into the 1930s, as Ruben was saying, the impact that Nazism and other fascist experiences have in places like Latin America is that it forces nationalists in general to kind of look for just alternative articulations of that nationalist sentiment, right? They start talking about nationalism as a sort of just as a kind of idea, a sentiment, a feeling, right? That in fact could become a sort of connection to other nationalist peoples, right? And this is a kind of an interesting paradox, Like how can we think of a nationalist internationalism, if you want, But that is the project of the far right, right? Fascists, neo-Nazis, all around the world do find a sense of brotherhood, right?
Yeah.
They are connected by that history, by that intellectual history. Now,
it wasn't about the white supremacy. It was about the friends we made along the way.
Exactly, right? I mean, of course, not to set aside the white supremacy part, But there is something about that, let's say, the intellectual and political environment of the 1930s that would make someone like Nieva Lopez, right, or all of these people around him, to be attracted to the ideas of Nazism or something that Nazism represented for them, without necessarily embracing all of it.
It was, I think it was really the nationalism and this idea of supremacy. Right. Everyone's vying for supremacy, whether it's Aryan, whether it's Mexica Azteca, or whatever other identity, or the Vikings now, for example, is one of those that comes into play as well. So everyone that is nationalistic and has sort of authoritarian inclinations tends to sort of lean in this direction of fascism in some way. It's really strange.
Well, what I've seen with the ARM, with their modern incarnations on Facebook, is they point to Nahuiolin symbols. And they're like, see, they equate it to the swastika, right? And they're like, this symbol has always been part of our heritage. So it's not a big deal for us to adopt swastikas. And it feeds into our, this is a symbol that we could rally our people around. But, as with all fascists and neo-fascists, they're just not very smart. So they don't know.
But don't underestimate the power of the myths that they create.
Yep.
Oh, absolutely.
Right, which is really what has informed the endurance of these ideas, these symbols. I mean, for so many decades, no, is that somehow, the swastika, for instance, does have these meanings. For instance, for neo-Nazis in Chile, right? Or Mexican far-right Catholics in Guanajuato, right? That's what, for instance, something that fascinates me is how does this thing that it already is, has a mythical articulation, right? With the Aryan race and all this stuff. How does it become appropriated, translated into these very different realities? And how is it that people embrace them with so much fervor, so much zeal into
they attach their own localized interpretations and their aspirations for what they view their version of nationalism to be, and they sort of put those on that swastika to reflect what they believe. So it doesn't necessarily reflect like the Nazis of Hitler, but it reflects their version of what Nazism is, right? That's what you're trying to get at.
Right, exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly.
So I want to thank Dr. Herrán Ávila for joining us today and having such a fascinating discussion about one of my favorite topics, right-wing nationalist weirdos. And before we go, do you have anything you would like to plug? Any upcoming presentations? Are you on Twitter?
I am on Twitter. I can certainly plug that. My Twitter handle is _Herrán, and you can find me there on Twitter. And just in maybe a couple of years, 2-3 years, look out for a book that is yet untitled, but
Derrota Mundial 2.
Exactly. Defeating Derrota Mundial, right? But it will be basically about, it will contain a lot of these stories, histories, right, of how we can think of Mexico also as a right-wing nation, right, as opposed to just the revolutionary tradition and the radical traditions. There's another Mexico that lives alongside that one, and that we should pay attention to.
So would this be El México más profundo?
El México, it's something like El México más facho.
Más facho.
There you go.
Good one. Well, thank you, Luis.
Well, my friend, the truth doesn't always taste good, but it's always good for you. I want to thank Dr. Herrán Ávila, my co-host, Dr. Tlacatecat, and yours truly. We hope you enjoyed this episode of Tales from Atlantis.
Mexico is under siege. A plot to poison the minds and hearts of our people, to turn them into religious fanatics. This evil, this threat, it will not be tolerated.
You're an army fighting for God and for the church. We will fight with honor and dignity.
The
United States. We've been following your war with the Catholic Church.
I would hardly call it a war.
There is a time for peace, a time for war.
Even if I were younger, I would not fight.
You cannot fight for something you don't believe in.
I believe in freedom. The fate of Mexico, it's in God's hands, not yours or mine.
This will be one of the most important battles of our struggle.
If you lose this war, we're not going to lose this war.
Why are you here?
We want to be cristeros.
Cristeros.
Yes.
We are going to send a message that freedom is our lives. And we will defend it or die trying. ¡Que viva Cristo Rey! ¡Que viva Cristo Rey!
Thank you for listening to Tales from Atlantis, a project of the Chimali Institute of Mesoamerican Arts. If you enjoy the show, please consider becoming a Patreon supporter. You can do this by visiting talesfromatlantis.com and clicking Support the Podcast. Your continued support will help keep the podcast ad-free and independent. Until next time, Timo Itase.